Francisco Goya, one of the most enigmatic and celebrated painters in the history of art, presents a fascinating yet unsettling paradox. His life, works, and psychological state provide a haunting glimpse into the human condition, manifesting in what has often been termed his dark period. This phase, primarily characterized by the infamous black paintings created in his later years, serves as a window into Goya's deteriorating mental and physical health. These works are drenched in shadow, both literally and metaphorically, and reflect the deepest recesses of human despair, fear, and madness. Born in Fuendetodos, Spain, in 1746, Francisco Goya's early life and career were relatively conventional. He exhibited a keen talent for painting, moving to Madrid to study under influential artists, and eventually becoming the official court painter for King Charles Roman IV of Spain. His earlier works reflected a sharp, satirical eye for societal conventions, showcasing his wit and mastery of portraiture. Goya was deeply attuned to the socio-political climate of Spain, and his early works are infused with critical observations of power, class, and human folly. Yet, it was not until a series of cataclysmic events in his life, particularly his severe illness in the early 1790s, that Goya's work began to delve into darker and more disturbing territories. The illness left him permanently deaf, and it is this moment that many art historians consider the turning point in his psychological and artistic trajectory. His isolation from the world of sound likely amplified his introspective tendencies and began to manifest in his art. The once vibrant and socially astute painter began to explore the themes of madness, death, and the grotesque in ways that had not been seen before in European art. His disillusionment with the world around him, spurred by the turbulence of the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish Inquisition, and the brutality of civil unrest, seeped into his works, creating images that are as much psychological exorcisms as they are paintings. Goya's dark period culminated in the creation of his black paintings between 1819 and 1823, which he painted directly onto the walls of his house, the Quinta del Sordo, House of the Deaf Man. The black paintings were never intended for public display, and this fact alone gives them a terrifying intimacy. These 14 pieces are unrelenting in their bleakness, offering a descent into Goya's fractured psyche, where fear, horror, and existential dread loom large. What makes these paintings particularly disquieting is that they seem to operate on an almost subconscious level, as if Goya had peeled back the veneer of civilized society to expose the raw, primal forces lurking beneath. Francisco Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son is a painting that defies the viewer's expectations of myth, beauty, and humanity. There is nothing heroic or regal in the portrayal of Saturn. Instead, he is a grotesque embodiment of primal fear, consuming his child with a desperation that feels both animalistic and all too human. The painting is not merely a depiction of a mythological event, it is an expression of horror, madness, and the deep terror of time itself. Saturn, the Roman god of time, feared that his children would overthrow him, as he had once done to his own father. In a futile attempt to halt the inevitable, he devours them, one by one. Goya captures this moment of cannibalism in a manner that is both visceral and deeply psychological. The figure of Saturn is emaciated, his muscles taut, his skin stretched over bones like a corpse brought back to life. His eyes bulge with manic terror, wide and wild, as though in that very moment he is possessed by an insatiable need. It is not hunger, but a more profound fear, the fear of being consumed by time itself, of facing one's own destruction. What is most unsettling about Goya's Saturn is the lack of ceremony in the act. He clutches the half-devoured corpse of his child like a beast, gnawing at the flesh, blood smeared across his face and hands. There is nothing divine here, only raw instinct, a god reduced to a state of utter savagery. His body, large and looming, is bathed in darkness, adding to the sense of inescapable doom that permeates the scene. The muted, earthy tones that Goya employs seem to trap the figure in a suffocating void, as though Saturn is devouring not just his child, but the very light and life around him. Goya's decision to paint this scene on the walls of his own home, hidden from public view, suggests that the work was intensely personal, a manifestation of his own inner torment. By the time Goya created Saturn Devouring His Son, he was an old man, deaf, and plagued by illness and despair. The world around him was crumbling in violence and war, and the darkness that crept into his mind spilled out onto the walls. Saturn, in this context, is not just a symbol of time or power. He is a reflection of Goya himself, consumed by fears of mortality, isolation, and madness. The child's broken body, limp and lifeless, offers no resistance. Its humanity is reduced to mere flesh, something to be destroyed, a reminder that even the most innocent are not spared from the ravages of time and decay. In Goya's hands, the myth transforms into a universal truth. Time consumes all, and no matter how desperately one may try to cling to life, the inevitable cannot be stopped. This painting leaves an indelible mark on the viewer, a lingering sense of dread. In Saturn's wide eyes, we see our own fear of death, of losing control, of being consumed by forces greater than ourselves. Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son confronts us with the darkest parts of existence, the inescapable, brutal truth that time devours everything, even the gods. Francisco Goya's The Dog is one of the most haunting and enigmatic paintings in his body of work. A stark representation of isolation, helplessness, and the quiet, suffocating weight of despair. The painting is deceptively simple in its composition. A small, barely discernible dog is the only figure in a vast, overwhelming void. Unlike other works of Goya's Black Paintings series, the dog does not shock with violent imagery or grotesque figures. Yet it evokes an equally unsettling, if not more profound, sense of dread and hopelessness. The dog itself is barely visible, its head emerging from the bottom of the canvas, looking upward, as though pleading or searching for something beyond the oppressive expanse above it. The creature's expression is ambiguous, but deeply sorrowful, its dark eyes almost lost in the muted, sandy background. There is no ground beneath it, no context or setting that could give the viewer any sense of where this dog is. It seems to be sinking, swallowed by the void, with only its head remaining above the surface, as if trapped in some terrible, inescapable limbo. The lack of details, the absence of a clear narrative, makes the painting even more unnerving. The viewer is left to confront the unsettling emptiness that Goya has created. In many ways, the dog is a metaphor for the human condition lost in a world that is vast, indifferent, and ultimately uncaring. The dog's futile upward gaze reflects our own search for meaning in a universe that offers no answers. It is a symbol of abandonment, left alone to face the void, much like Goya himself in the final years of his life. By the time he painted the dog, Goya was old, ill, and deeply disillusioned. His earlier works, filled with the grandeur of society and the human form, had given way to a darker, more introspective style, where isolation and existential dread became the dominant themes. The empty space that surrounds the dog in the painting is suffocating in its vastness, reinforcing the sense that the creature and, by extension, humanity is dwarfed by forces beyond comprehension. There is no clear horizon, no sky, no ground, just an infinite, oppressive void. This ambiguity creates an atmosphere of existential terror. The viewer is left to wonder, is the dog searching for something that isn't there? Is it on the brink of disappearing entirely? Is it trapped, abandoned, or simply resigned to its fate? Goya offers no answers, only the quiet, haunting image of a creature utterly alone. There is a deep, unspoken tragedy in the dog. It speaks to the feeling of being overwhelmed by life, of facing forces too great to understand or escape. The dog's gaze, so plaintive and yet so resigned, invites the viewer to confront their own fears of isolation, insignificance, and the suffocating weight of existence. In this quiet, desolate painting, Goya manages to capture the essence of existential despair, leaving behind a work that, despite its simplicity, resonates with a timeless and unsettling truth. Sometimes, we are all the dog, lost in the vast, indifferent emptiness of the world, searching for something we may never find. Francisco Goya's Witches' Sabbath stands as one of the most unsettling depictions of witchcraft and the supernatural in art history. Painted as part of his Black Painting series, it offers a dark and nightmarish view into the grotesque and the occult, pulling the viewer into a world where fear, madness, and evil reign supreme. Unlike other depictions of witches throughout history, which often carried a certain theatricality or whimsy, Goya's portrayal strips away any hint of humor, leaving only terror and horror in its wake. At the center of the painting, a towering, ominous figure of the devil presides over the scene. The devil, in the form of a grotesque, black goat, looms large, dominating the composition with its ghastly, deformed features. Its eyes seem dead, hollow, and soulless, yet it exudes an aura of power and malevolence. This figure is not merely a trickster or a figure of rebellion, but an embodiment of evil in its purest form, worshipped by the witches that surround it. They gather around the goat in a twisted display of devotion, as if this entity holds absolute power over them. The light, muted and eerie, adds to the oppressive atmosphere, casting long shadows that seem to devour the figures themselves. The witches, huddled beneath the devil, are grotesque caricatures of humanity. Their twisted, contorted forms reflect both physical and moral corruption. Goya presents them as decrepit, their faces distorted into leering, hollow-eyed expressions of madness. They seem both terrified and reverent, caught in a frenzy of fear and worship, as if bound to the very evil they revere. Some appear gaunt, almost skeletal, while others seem bloated, their bodies distorted as though cursed by the dark forces they embrace. Their very appearance suggests decay, both physical and spiritual, as though the act of serving the devil has corroded their very being. What makes Witches' Sabbath even more unsettling is Goya's refusal to clearly define what is real and what is imagined. There is a nightmarish quality to the scene, as though it exists on the edge of hallucination, a fevered vision pulled from the darkest depths of the human psyche. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blur, leaving the viewer questioning whether this is an actual event or a manifestation of deep-seated fears and superstitions. This ambiguity is central to the painting's power. It refuses to offer any solace, any rational explanation. It simply is, and in that, it reflects the terrifying nature of the unknown and the irrational. At the time Goya painted Witches' Sabbath, Europe was rife with fear and paranoia regarding witchcraft and the occult. The Inquisition still cast a long shadow, and belief in witches and demons persisted. But Goya's painting is more than just a reflection of these cultural anxieties. It's an exploration of the darkness that lies within humanity itself. The witches, in their servitude to the devil, represent a surrender to chaos, fear, and evil. There is no hope in this painting, no redemption. The witches are lost, bound to their master, and the world they inhabit is one of complete moral corruption. Goya's Witches' Sabbath is not merely a depiction of witches performing their dark rituals. It is a disturbing exploration of humanity's relationship with evil, superstition, and fear. The painting confronts the viewer with the terrifying possibility that the true horror lies not in the supernatural, but in the depths of the human soul, capable of surrendering to darkness without question. It is a vision of a world without light, where evil reigns unchallenged, and the only escape is into madness or death. Francisco Goya's Two Old Men Eating Soup is an eerie and unsettling piece that stands out even among his black paintings for its grotesque portrayal of human decay and mortality. Like much of the series, this work reflects Goya's growing disillusionment with life and humanity during his later years, a time marked by his increasing isolation, illness, and a deepening sense of existential dread. In this painting, Goya reduces life to its most bleak and grotesque elements, stripping away any pretense of beauty or dignity. The painting depicts two elderly figures, their faces weathered and hollow, sitting together in an intimate yet profoundly disturbing scene. One of the men, his face barely more than a skull with skin stretched tightly over bone, leans forward as he consumes a bowl of soup with a kind of desperate, skeletal hunger. His eyes are vacant, black hollows, making him appear more like a ghoul than a living being. The second figure, hunched over and equally decrepit, watches with a grim expression, his face twisted into a silent, toothless grin that borders on the macabre. Together, they form an image that is haunting in its simplicity, as if time has reduced them to their most base, animalistic instincts. There is no warmth in the scene, no sense of camaraderie or comfort between the two old men. Instead, their act of eating something so simple, so necessary for life, feels like a slow march toward death. The soup they consume, often a symbol of sustenance and survival, here becomes a representation of futility. The act of nourishment is rendered meaningless, as these two figures are already lost to decay, their existence reduced to a mere prolonging of the inevitable. They are not sustaining life, but delaying death in the most grotesque manner possible. The colors Goya uses are murky and dark, with shades of brown and gray dominating the scene. This palette evokes a sense of rot and decay, amplifying the overwhelming feeling of desolation. The background is indistinct, a void that offers no hope or comfort, much like the lives of the two figures themselves. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere envelops the men, giving the impression that they are trapped in a liminal space between life and death, caught in a moment that stretches on endlessly, without release. Goya's brushwork here is loose and erratic, lending a chaotic, almost unfinished quality to the painting. This reflects not only the physical decay of the figures, but also the mental and emotional turmoil of the artist himself. The image seems to dissolve at the edges, blurring the boundaries between flesh and spirit, reality and nightmare. There is a dreamlike quality to the scene, but it is a nightmare of stagnation and decline, a visual representation of the slow, agonizing erosion of life. Two Old Men Eating Soup is, at its core, a meditation on mortality. It confronts the viewer with the harsh reality of aging and the inevitability of death, but it goes further than that. It strips away the comfort we often try to associate with the end of life. There is no peace here, no gentle passage into the afterlife. Instead, Goya shows us the horror of clinging to existence long past its point of meaning or dignity. The men in this painting are not merely old. They are grotesque parodies of what it means to live, reduced to mindless consumption, their humanity slipping away as they descend into something more primal, more disturbing. In many ways, the painting can be seen as a reflection of Goya's own fear of death, or perhaps even worse, the fear of living on in a state of decay, stripped of vitality, but forced to persist. It is a stark, brutal vision of life's final stages, where the boundaries between life and death blur, and existence becomes a grotesque dance with oblivion. Francisco Goya's Asmodea is one of the most mysterious and disturbing pieces from his Black Paintings series, an artwork that embodies Goya's descent into a world of nightmares and dark symbolism. Named after Asmodeus, the demon of lust and destruction from ancient mythology, the painting captures an atmosphere of chaos, terror, and impending doom. It reflects Goya's deep-seated anxieties about the political and social turmoil of his time. But on a deeper level, it is an expression of existential fear, a vision of humanity being swept away by forces far beyond its control. In Asmodea, the viewer is immediately drawn to the central figures, a pair of mysterious women floating in the sky. The larger of the two appears to be guiding or dragging the other across a desolate landscape. Both figures seem weightless, as though carried by the wind or some invisible force. But their expressions are strained, full of anguish and terror. The woman in the foreground has an almost supernatural appearance, her face contorted in a grotesque expression, as though she is not fully human, while the other looks back at the land below, eyes wide with dread, as though witnessing something horrifying. The landscape beneath them is barren and bleak, filled with tiny, indistinct figures fleeing in panic, reinforcing the overwhelming sense of catastrophe. The horizon is dark, blending into the murky sky, creating an impression of endless desolation. These fleeing figures appear as small and powerless against the vast, empty world around them, suggesting that whatever terror haunts them is inescapable. The landscape itself seems to stretch on into infinity, a wasteland devoid of hope or safety. The title Asmodea evokes the figure of Asmodeus, a demonic presence associated with lust, destruction, and chaos. In Christian mythology, Asmodeus is known as a demon who corrupts and leads humans astray, often tied to uncontrollable desires and ruinous behavior. Goya's Asmodea hints at the presence of such a force, a malevolent energy that drags humanity toward its downfall. The floating figures, particularly the leading one, could be seen as embodiments of this demonic force, guiding or manipulating events toward some dark, inevitable conclusion. The figures fleeing on the ground, unaware of their fate, are like helpless pawns in this cosmic game of destruction. The emotional impact of Asmodea is magnified by Goya's use of color and light, or rather, the absence of it. The painting is dominated by dark, muted tones, creating an oppressive atmosphere that feels heavy and suffocating. The brushstrokes are rough and loose, giving the painting a chaotic, unfinished quality, as though the scene itself is unraveling before our eyes. There is a dreamlike, nightmarish quality to the whole composition, as though the viewer has been drawn into a surreal vision of apocalypse, where reason and logic no longer apply. At its core, Asmodea is a representation of fear of the unknown, of chaos, of forces too powerful to resist or understand. The painting can be interpreted as a reflection of Goya's deep anxieties about the political upheaval in Spain at the time, a country torn apart by war, revolution, and societal breakdown. But beyond the political, Asmodea speaks to more universal fears. The terror of losing control, of being swept away by powers greater than oneself. It taps into the primal fear of destruction and chaos, where humanity is nothing more than a helpless bystander to its own ruin. Goya, in his later years, was haunted by his own mortality and the state of the world around him. Asmodea is an embodiment of that dark vision, a world on the brink of collapse, where even the heavens are filled with malevolent forces, and the earth is a wasteland of fear and despair. It is a deeply unsettling work, one that lingers in the mind long after the viewer has looked away, a reminder that beneath the surface of civilization lies a thin veneer, easily shattered by chaos and destruction. Francisco Goya's Leocadia is one of the most melancholic and enigmatic works in his black painting series. In contrast to the grotesque horrors and chaotic scenes that dominate much of the series, Leocadia stands out as a deeply introspective and quiet portrayal, shrouded in ambiguity and sorrow. The painting is thought to depict Goya's final companion, Leocadia Weiss, though whether the figure in the painting is truly her or simply a symbolic representation of grief, loss, or impending death remains unclear. What is certain, however, is the overwhelming sense of despair that the painting evokes, as it serves as a reflection of Goya's own state of mind during his final years. In Leocadia, the central figure sits hunched, draped in dark, heavy clothing that envelops her almost completely. The palette is overwhelmingly somber, dominated by shades of brown, black, and gray, creating an oppressive atmosphere that matches the heavy mood of the subject. Her face is partially obscured by shadow, and her expression, though not fully visible, conveys an unmistakable weariness. She leans against a mound of earth, a gesture that hints at resignation, as though she is waiting, perhaps mourning, or contemplating the inevitability of death. This gesture also subtly evokes the imagery of a mourner at a grave, reinforcing the theme of loss that permeates the painting. The figure's posture is one of quiet submission, as if she has succumbed to the weight of time and grief. Her downcast eyes and slumped shoulders suggest emotional exhaustion, the kind that comes from living through years of pain and hardship. In many ways, she mirrors Goya himself, who, by this time, was an old, ailing man, isolated from the world around him, deaf, and tormented by both his personal demons and the horrors he had witnessed during his lifetime. The figure of Leocadia becomes a symbol not just of one woman's sorrow, but of the collective human experience of suffering, aging, and the inescapable passage of time. What makes Leocadia especially poignant is the painting's quiet intensity. Unlike other works in the Black Painting series, there is no overt display of madness or supernatural terror. Instead, The terror in Leocadia is subtle and internal. It is the terror of solitude, of time running out, of watching life slowly erode without any ability to stop it. The darkness in the painting is not the darkness of night or oblivion, but the internal darkness of the soul, weighed down by the relentless march toward death. The background of the painting is vague and undefined, an indistinct void that adds to the feeling of isolation. There are no signs of life, no markers of a specific location. The figure is alone in an almost featureless space, further amplifying the sense of emotional abandonment. Goya's brushstrokes are rough, as if capturing the fraying edges of a reality that is slowly unraveling, blurring the boundaries between the figure and the space around her. This lack of clarity serves to heighten the painting's emotional impact, making the figure of Leocadia appear even more lost and disconnected from the world. Some art historians have speculated that the mound of earth upon which she leans may represent Goya's own grave, and that Leocadia is mourning his inevitable death, already preparing for the loss of the man she had cared for. This interpretation adds another layer of poignancy to the painting. Leocadia, in this reading, becomes a figure of quiet devotion, trapped in her own grief for a man not yet gone but already fading away. She is a witness to Goya's slow decline, and in her silence, she speaks volumes about the helplessness that comes with watching someone you love slip into the shadows of death. Leocadia is, in many ways, a meditation on mortality. It is not loud or chaotic, but deeply personal, an intimate reflection on the quiet suffering that accompanies the end of life. Goya, through this painting, confronts not just his own mortality, but the universal experience of loss and the loneliness that follows. In Leocadia, the true horror is not the supernatural, but the mundane, inevitable end that waits for us all: death, and the sorrow it leaves behind. Goya's black paintings, taken together, are a profound exploration of the human psyche under duress. They confront the viewer with the realities of fear, madness, mortality, and the corrupting influence of power. These works are deeply personal, yet they speak to universal themes of existential dread and the fragility of human life. The darkness in Goya's paintings is not merely a stylistic choice, but a reflection of his own inner turmoil and the world's descent into chaos during his lifetime. His paintings offer no comfort, no resolution, only a stark, unflinching gaze into the abyss. Through his art, Goya became a witness to the darkest aspects of humanity, and in doing so, created works that continue to resonate with viewers today, reminding us of the inescapable shadows that lurk within us all.